Number 1. Anthony Edward Sowell. He was a quiet figure on the east side of Cleveland, the kind of neighbor people barely noticed. And that was exactly why the truth would later shake the entire state. Imagine believing you live in an ordinary neighborhood, only to learn that one house on the block holds a secret darker than anything you could imagine. That was the unsettling reality that surrounded Anthony Sowell, a man whose life appeared unremarkable, until investigators pushed open a door that revealed years of hidden violence. Before his crimes came to light, Sowell's background didn't hint at what was to come. Born in 1959, he grew up in a crowded and troubled household where discipline was severe and opportunities were limited. As an adult, he served in the United States Marine Corps, a period that seemed to give him direction and structure. After leaving the military, he returned to Cleveland, lived with relatives for a time, and later settled into a home on Imperial Avenue. To anyone on the outside, he seemed like a solitary man, keeping mostly to himself, occasionally working odd jobs and navigating life quietly. But behind that quiet exterior was a pattern of behavior that would eventually unravel everything. The crimes that later shocked the state unfolded over several years, beginning around 2007. Women from the area would go missing, often without immediate alarm because many were vulnerable or disconnected from strong support networks. The disappearances did not form a clear pattern at first, and no one suspected that a single address held the answers. Sowell would invite women to his home, and several never left. He was later convicted of killing 11 women, each case representing a life lost and a family left searching for answers. As time went on, neighbors began noticing strange odors around the property, but explanations were vague, and the source remained unknown. The turning point came in late October 2009. A woman went to police with a report that she had escaped from Sowell's home, and her account pushed investigators to act. When officers arrived at the residence on Imperial Avenue, they expected a routine search. Instead, what they found stunned even seasoned investigators. Human remains were discovered inside and outside the house, some hidden in crawl spaces, others concealed in the yard. What began as a single investigation quickly expanded into one of the most significant crime scenes in Ohio's recent history. The discovery ignited a massive investigation. Detectives started linking the remains to local missing persons cases, building a timeline that stretched back years. As the evidence mounted, Sowell was located after a brief search and taken into custody. Interviews with neighbors revealed years of complaints about odors, but no one had been able to trace the cause. Investigators pieced together the stories of the victims, many of whom had last been seen near Imperial Avenue. Each connection reinforced the scale of what had happened. The legal process that followed was long, emotional, and heavily covered by the media. Sowell faced multiple charges, including numerous counts of aggravated homicide, kidnapping, and related offenses. Both sides presented extensive arguments. Prosecutors described a pattern of targeted violence, while the defense attempted to present mitigating factors from Sowell's background, including mental health issues and the difficult environment in which he was raised. As testimony unfolded, families of the victims described the pain of searching for loved ones, often without answers for months or years. In July 2011, after months of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Sowell was convicted on multiple counts, including the killing of 11 women. The sentencing phase followed, and the prosecution sought the most severe penalty available. After weighing the evidence and the impact on the victims' families, the jury recommended the death sentence. In August 2011, the court formally sentenced Sowell to death. He was transferred to death row, where he remained for years while appeals progressed. Sowell never faced execution. In February 2021, while still incarcerated, he died at a hospital after an illness. His death closed one chapter of the case, but did not lessen the lasting impact on the families, the community, and the city of Cleveland. The house on Imperial Avenue was eventually demolished, leaving behind an empty lot and a painful memory of what had once been hidden behind its walls. Looking back, the case forces a difficult question. How could so much happen in plain sight without anyone realizing the full truth? It reminds us that even in familiar neighborhoods, unseen suffering can exist behind closed doors, and that the voices of vulnerable people matter deeply. The story of Anthony Sowell stands as one of Ohio's most devastating criminal cases, a reminder of the importance of listening, noticing, and acting before silence grows into tragedy. Number 2, Shawn Michael Great. She was searching for a place to rest, just a quiet spot to gather her thoughts, when she crossed paths with a man whose calm voice hid something far more dangerous. Imagine stepping into what looks like an ordinary abandoned building, unaware that the door is closing behind you on one of Ohio's most chilling cases of the last quarter century. That is how the story of Shawn Great begins for many people who learned his name only after the investigation that exposed years of hidden violence. Before the truth surfaced, Great's life appeared scattered but not extraordinary. Born in 1976 in Ohio, he grew up in a home marked by instability, with a childhood that included difficult family relationships and constant movement. As an adult, he drifted between towns, relying on short-term jobs, temporary housing, and relationships that often ended abruptly. People who knew him described him as polite on the surface, even soft-spoken, the kind of person who could blend into everyday life without drawing suspicion. But underneath that quiet exterior was a history of troubling behavior, past incidents with partners, and a growing pattern of control and manipulation. The crimes that later defined his name unfolded between 2006 and 2016. Great targeted vulnerable women, often those without strong support systems or stable housing. Over the years, several women disappeared after last being seen in areas where he lived or spent time. Because the disappearances involved people who were already struggling with isolation or hardship, their cases did not initially create a clear pattern. Great moved frequently, living in small towns, abandoned properties, and temporary rentals, leaving little trace and avoiding the kind of permanent connections that might have drawn more attention. The turning point came in September 2016, when a woman managed to escape from an abandoned house in Ashland, Ohio. She had been held inside the building, and after days of fear and uncertainty, she found an opportunity to reach a phone. In the early morning hours, she quietly dialed 911 and whispered for help, telling the dispatcher she was trapped and that the man holding her was asleep. Her voice was barely audible, but that call would change everything. Police acted immediately, surrounding the property on Covert Court. When they entered, they found her alive and freed her from the room where she had been kept. As officers searched the rest of the building, they discovered human remains inside, confirming that the case was far bigger than a single victim. Once Great was taken into custody, investigators began uncovering the full scope of what had happened over the previous decade. He was linked to multiple victims, including women whose disappearances had remained unsolved for years. Searches extended to other counties, connecting him to cases in Mansfield, Ashland, and Marion. Detectives traced his movements, examined his interviews, and compared evidence across jurisdictions. At first, some details were unclear, but as investigators pieced together timelines, a disturbing picture emerged. Great had taken advantage of those who trusted him, those who needed help, and those who believed they were safe in his presence. The investigation also revealed details about how Great had lived in the abandoned Ashland home for weeks, unnoticed by the community. This aspect of the case added another layer of shock. The idea that such a significant crime scene could exist in the middle of a neighborhood without residents realizing anything was wrong. The woman who escaped became a key witness, and her survival became the pivotal turning point that allowed authorities to uncover the truth. The legal process moved forward quickly due to the overwhelming evidence. Great faced numerous charges in different counties, including multiple counts of aggravated homicide, kidnapping, and related offenses. In Ashland County, prosecutors presented evidence involving the victims found at the covert court property and the survivor who made the 911 call. The prosecution argued that Great acted intentionally and repeatedly, targeting women he believed no one would look for. The defense raised mental health issues, suggesting that his background and emotional state should be taken into account, but the jury found the evidence clear and compelling. In 2018, Great was convicted on numerous charges, including 2 counts of aggravated homicide that carried the possibility of the death penalty. During the sentencing phase, the jury weighed the arguments from both sides, but the severity and pattern of the crimes led them to recommend a sentence of death. The court agreed, and Sean Great was formally sentenced to death in Ashland County, with additional sentences in Marion County for other cases connected to him. He was transferred to death row, where he remains today as his appeals move through the judicial system. As of now, Great is still incarcerated in Ohio, continuing the appeals process that is standard in capital cases. Some appeals have focused on mental health claims or procedural questions, but the core convictions have remained intact. For the families of the victims, the legal proceedings provided answers after years of uncertainty, though no sentence could undo the harm or bring back the lives that were lost. Reflecting on the case, it leaves behind an unsettling truth. Danger often hides behind ordinary faces, and some of the most devastating crimes occur quietly, without the dramatic scenes people imagine. The survival of one woman and her bravery in making that whispered phone call became the key that unlocked years of unanswered questions. The story of Sean Michael Great stands as a reminder of the importance of listening to those who feel unsafe, of paying attention to those who disappear, and of understanding that evil can exist even in places that seem calm on the surface. Number 3. Michael Madison. He seemed like just another man living in a struggling neighborhood, someone passing on the sidewalk without a second thought. But imagine walking by an ordinary apartment building every day, never realizing that behind one of those doors, a case was unfolding that would horrify an entire community. That was the chilling reality surrounding Michael Madison, a figure who blended into East Cleveland until investigators uncovered what had been hidden in plain sight. Before the crimes were uncovered, Madison's life appeared scattered but not unusual. Born in 1977, he grew up in Ohio, moving between caregivers and enduring a childhood marked by instability. As he entered adulthood, he worked various low-wage jobs, struggled with employment, and had prior run-ins with the law that hinted at a troubling pattern of behavior. Still, to those who knew him casually, he came across as quiet and reserved. He lived alone, kept mostly to himself, and didn't draw the kind of attention that would make anyone suspect what was happening behind closed doors. The crimes that later defined his name took place between 2012 and 2013. Madison targeted women from the area, often those who were vulnerable or lived close to his apartment building. Over time, residents began noticing strange odors around the property. Some suspected a dead animal or garbage, but nothing seemed clear enough to spark immediate action. The truth remained hidden, and Madison continued living in the building as though nothing was wrong, maintaining the same quiet routine that made him seem unremarkable. Everything changed in July 2013. Police were called to the neighborhood after reports of a foul smell coming from a garage behind Madison's residence. Officers arrived and began searching the area, expecting to find something minor. Instead, the discovery they made would unravel the entire case. Human remains were found inside a garage linked to Madison. That finding triggered a larger search, leading investigators to widen the perimeter and check nearby properties. As they continued, they discovered additional victims, one in a backyard and another inside an empty house just steps away. In total, 3 women were found, and the neighborhood was plunged into shock. As the investigation intensified, neighbors began sharing memories, small details they had overlooked, unusual odors they had noticed, moments when Madison seemed agitated or watched people from his window. Detectives searched his apartment, gathered evidence, and traced his movements during the months leading up to the discoveries. Each piece of information added clarity to a timeline filled with unanswered questions. Madison was detained by police after a brief search, and once in custody, the case quickly gained national attention. The legal process moved forward with several charges, including aggravated homicide and kidnapping. Prosecutors argued that Madison acted deliberately, selecting victims who lived close by and using his familiarity with the neighborhood to avoid detection. They also noted the similarity between Madison's crimes and those of another Cleveland serial killer, Anthony Sowell, though the court focused on Madison alone. The defense raised issues concerning his upbringing, arguing that years of trauma and instability had shaped his behavior. But the evidence, including the locations of the victims and forensic findings, painted a clear picture of responsibility. In May 2016, after a detailed and emotional trial, a jury found Madison guilty on all major charges connected to the 3 victims. The sentencing phase followed, during which the prosecution emphasized the impact on the victims' families and the community. The jury ultimately recommended the death penalty, citing the severity and pattern of the crimes. In June 2016, the judge agreed with that recommendation and formally sentenced Michael Madison to death. Madison remained on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution while his appeals moved forward. One key appeal reached the Ohio Supreme Court, but in 2020, the court upheld both his conviction and his death sentence, maintaining the original judgment. That affirmed his status and left him awaiting further legal review, as is common in capital cases. In 2024, before his sentence could be carried out, Madison died at a hospital after suffering a medical emergency while still incarcerated. His death closed the legal chapter of the case, but for many in East Cleveland, the emotional impact remains. Residents still remember the searches, the sirens, the shock of learning that such a tragic series of events had occurred so close to their homes. Reflecting on the case, it raises a haunting question about how danger can exist unnoticed, hiding behind routine moments and familiar faces. The story of Michael Madison reminds us that communities often sense when something is wrong, even if the signs don't immediately add up. It reinforces the importance of paying attention, speaking up, and recognizing that the truth sometimes rests behind the smallest details. Details that, once uncovered, reveal a story far more devastating than anyone ever expected. Number 4. Edward Wayne Edwards. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly win people over, smiling, joking, telling stories about his past as if he were some kind of reformed outlaw. But imagine meeting someone who seems charming and harmless, only to learn years later that the truth behind that friendly exterior is far darker than anything he ever admitted. That was the unsettling reality of Edward Wayne Edwards, a man whose crimes stretched across states and decades, and whose eventual confession tied him directly to cases in Ohio that left investigators stunned. Before the truth finally came to light, Edwards had built a public image that made him seem almost larger than life. Born in 1933, he grew up in an orphanage after a childhood marked by hardship. and he often used that early suffering as part of his life story. As an adult, he moved constantly, drifting through jobs and cities, presenting himself as someone who had overcome a criminal youth. In the 1970s, he even published a memoir claiming he had turned his life around, and he appeared on television programs that highlighted supposed stories of redemption. He married, raised children, and to neighbors he looked like a man who had left trouble behind him. But behind the facade, investigators would later discover a series of crimes he had managed to hide for decades. The crimes connected to Edwards spanned several states, but the case that brought him back into the national spotlight occurred in Ohio. In 1977, two teenagers, Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, attended a wedding in Sullivan, Ohio. It was a summer evening, a small-town celebration, the kind of event where nothing seemed out of place. But the next day, both teens were missing. Weeks later, their bodies were found in a rural area, and what began as a joyful night turned into one of Ohio's most haunting unsolved cases. For years, their families lived with unanswered questions, and detectives followed lead after lead, only for the trail to fade again and again. Edwards was in the area at the time, working odd jobs and living briefly in the community. But back then, he didn't stand out. He was friendly, helpful, and presented himself as a family man. The idea that he could be connected to such a tragedy seemed unthinkable to those who had met him. The investigation continued for decades, with changing detectives, new technology, and shifting theories, but no suspect was ever charged. The case grew cold, and for a long time, it seemed the truth might never surface. Everything changed more than 30 years later. In 2009, Edwards was arrested in Wisconsin for a different case involving the killing of a couple in 1980. As investigators looked deeper into his history, they noticed patterns: the constant movement, the unexplained departures, the timing of several unsolved cases that matched his travel routes. Detectives in Ohio revisited the Sullivan case with new tools, including forensic techniques that had not existed in the 1970s. The more they looked, the clearer the picture became. Evidence that had once seemed incomplete now pointed directly toward Edwards. The turning point came when Edwards began speaking to investigators. In interviews, he displayed the same confidence and charisma he had used throughout his life, but he also revealed details that only someone involved would know. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. He admitted his role in the 1977 Ohio case, providing information that matched the evidence and answering questions that had haunted the community for decades. For families who had waited nearly a lifetime for answers, the confession brought a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Once the confession was secured, the legal process moved forward quickly. In Ohio, Edwards was charged with the killings of Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, and given the overwhelming evidence and his own admissions, he chose to plead guilty in 2010. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, his presence in Sullivan, and the connections that had eluded earlier investigators. The court acknowledged the long delay, the painful years for the families, and the importance of finally bringing closure. Edwards received a life sentence for the Ohio case, added to his existing convictions. But his legal troubles did not end there. In Wisconsin, Edwards faced the death penalty for the 1980 case involving a young couple who had been found in a park. During that trial, prosecutors described him as someone who spent decades using charm and deception to hide serious crimes. In 2010, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death. It was a rare moment of accountability for a man who had evaded suspicion for so long, slipping through communities while leaving devastation behind him. Edwards did not live long enough to face execution. In April 2011, less than a year after receiving his death sentence, he died in prison from natural causes. His death closed the legal chapter of a case that had stretched across nearly half a century. For investigators, it was a reminder of the importance of never giving up on cold cases. For the families of the victims, it was both an ending and a reminder of how long justice can take. Looking back, the story of Edward Wayne Edwards leaves behind a lingering question. How many chances do people get before their true nature emerges? He built an entire life around convincing others he had changed, using charm and storytelling to hide the darkness underneath. His case stands as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that patience, persistence, and the advancement of investigative tools can finally bring answers, even when decades have passed. His name remains linked to the Ohio case, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because it shows how the truth can surface long after the world has stopped looking. Number 5. Donald Harvey. He was known in the hospital halls as a quiet, dependable worker, someone who moved from room to room with a calm expression and a soft voice. But imagine trusting the person who brings meals, checks vitals, and offers a comforting smile, only to discover years later that this same person had been causing unexplained deaths all around you. That was the chilling reality behind Donald Harvey, a man whose crimes would eventually make him one of the most infamous figures in Ohio's modern history. Before the truth emerged, Harvey's life seemed ordinary, even unremarkable. Born in 1952 in Kentucky, he grew up in a small, rural community where neighbors knew each other and life followed a steady rhythm. As a young adult, he moved to Cincinnati in the early 1970s and found work in the medical field, first as an orderly, then as a nursing assistant. He had no formal medical qualifications, but he learned quickly, and supervisors often noted his reliability. He showed up early, stayed late, and rarely complained. For co-workers, he blended into the fabric of the hospital, one of many staff members working long shifts to keep the facility running. His quiet nature made him easy to overlook, and in an environment built on trust, no one imagined he was hiding anything. The crimes that later shocked Ohio took place primarily in hospitals where Harvey worked. His pattern began in the 1970s and continued into the 1980s. Patients who were already ill or recovering from serious conditions would suddenly decline. At first, the deaths raised no major alarm because hospitals frequently handled severe cases. When someone passed away, staff focused on the medical explanations, not on the possibility that a fellow employee might be involved. Harvey later claimed he believed he was easing suffering, but investigators who reviewed the cases saw something very different. A pattern of deliberate actions that led to the deaths of dozens of patients. For years, Harvey operated without drawing attention. He worked quietly, kept to himself, and rarely showed emotion. Patients trusted him, staff relied on him, and families saw him as another helpful face in a stressful environment. But small signs began surfacing: unusual lab results, unexpected patient declines, and incidents that didn't fit standard medical outcomes. Still, no one connected the dots. Harvey continued his routine, moving from shift to shift, confident that he was beyond suspicion. The turning point came in 1987. Harvey was working at the Cincinnati VA Medical Center when a patient suddenly died under circumstances that seemed inconsistent with his earlier condition. A suspicious physician ordered toxicology tests, which revealed traces of a substance that should never have been present. This finding forced the hospital to look more closely at the events surrounding the death. As investigators reviewed Harvey's access, behavior, and history, their concerns grew. They questioned coworkers, examined medical charts, and looked for patterns. Each step pointed to the same person: the quiet, reliable hospital worker who had been trusted for years. Confronted with mounting evidence, Harvey confessed. But what began as a confession involving one patient quickly expanded into something far more disturbing. He told investigators that he had caused the deaths of numerous patients over a period of years, describing methods that ranged from tampering with medical equipment to introducing harmful substances. His admissions shocked even seasoned detectives. They had expected a single case. Instead, they found themselves uncovering one of the most extensive serial homicide cases in American history. The legal process was complex because Harvey's crimes spanned multiple hospitals in different states. In Ohio, he faced numerous charges related to the patients whose deaths were directly linked to his actions. Prosecutors argued that he had taken advantage of his position, using the trust placed in him to hide a long pattern of deliberate harm. The defense attempted to raise issues about his mental state, including claims that he had acted out of misguided compassion. But the sheer number of cases, combined with forensic findings and Harvey's own admissions, made the overall picture undeniable. In 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty in Ohio to multiple counts of aggravated homicide. He avoided the death penalty through the plea agreement and received multiple consecutive life sentences. He also faced charges in Kentucky for additional victims. In 1988, he pleaded guilty there as well and received another life sentence, ensuring that he would never be released. Over time, investigators estimated that Harvey was responsible for more than 70 patient deaths, though the exact number will likely never be known with certainty. What is clear is that his actions left deep emotional scars on families, medical staff, and entire communities. Harvey served his sentence in an Ohio prison for decades. He remained largely quiet, giving occasional interviews, but offering little insight into his motivations beyond vague explanations about relieving suffering or preventing what he believed to be further decline. These claims never aligned with evidence showing that many patients were not near death when he intervened. His name became synonymous with a profound breach of trust, someone who entered a caregiving profession and used that access to harm the very people he was supposed to protect. In March 2017, while incarcerated at the Toledo Correctional Institution, Harvey was attacked by another inmate. He was taken to a hospital for treatment, but died from his injuries 2 days later. His death brought an end to the criminal case, but not to the lingering impact of his actions. Families of the victims continued to grapple with losses that had occurred decades earlier, and changes in hospital oversight and monitoring were strengthened in the years after Harvey's crimes came to light. Looking back, the story of Donald Harvey forces an uncomfortable reflection on the nature of trust. Hospitals are places where people feel vulnerable, where lives hang in the balance, and where workers are expected to offer care, compassion, and protection. Harvey exploited that environment, hiding behind a quiet smile and a gentle demeanor while committing acts that defied the very purpose of his job. His case stands as a reminder that vigilance, transparency, and accountability are essential in every profession, especially in those built on the trust of people at their most fragile. Number 6. Thomas Lee Dillon. In the quiet rural landscape of Ohio, where forests stretch across miles and anglers gather along peaceful rivers, few people ever imagined something evil watching from the tree line. But beginning in the late 1980s, that peaceful world was shattered. Someone, an unknown sniper, was hunting humans, and for years, nobody could stop him. This is the chilling story of Thomas Lee Dillon, one of the most disturbing killers in Ohio's history, a man who turned the wilderness into his personal hunting ground. If you walked past Dillon on the street in Canton, Ohio, you'd never think he was dangerous. He worked as a draftsman for the county engineer's office, had a wife, a child, and a quiet suburban home. On the surface, he was painfully normal, but underneath that mask was a man whose obsession with guns, violence, and destruction had grown out of control. Dillon spent much of his free time driving back roads alone, carrying rifles and ammunition in his truck. He had a documented history of vandalism, arson, and shooting farm animals. But these incidents were seen as weird, not deadly. No one suspected that the man who enjoyed randomly firing at cattle and setting barns on fire would soon begin targeting human beings. His murders began in 1989, and for the next 3 years, his victims seemed to have nothing in common. They were fishermen, hunters, hikers, ordinary men who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were no close-range attacks, no confrontations, no patterns that detectives could easily recognize. Every one of these killings came from a distance, usually with a high-powered rifle. It was clean, silent, and terrifyingly precise. The first known victim was Donald Metz, a 35-year-old man fishing at a Tuscarawas County pond. Metz was shot once, collapsing instantly. There were no witnesses and no clear motive. Investigators were baffled. A year later, Jamie Paxton, a 21-year-old hunter, was found dead in the woods after being shot multiple times. Paxton's death shook the community. He was well known, well liked, and experienced in the outdoors. Whoever killed him struck without warning, then vanished into the forest. Next came Kevin Loring, shot and killed while walking his dog. Then Claude Hawkins, targeted while fishing from a bridge, and Gary Bradley, shot during a simple weekend outing in the woods. Different counties, different environments, different victims. The only similarity, all of them were outdoors and isolated. To local law enforcement, the cases seemed unrelated. Different jurisdictions, different investigative teams. Nobody was connecting the dots, but one agency was paying close attention: the FBI. They began to suspect that these so-called accidents and hunting mishaps weren't accidents at all. Someone was firing from a distance, killing with sniper-like precision, and enjoying it. Meanwhile, Dillon was living his normal life, returning to work every Monday as if nothing had happened. But something about him bothered the people around him. He bragged about shooting animals for fun. He went on long, unexplained trips, and he had a strange fascination with violent crimes that appeared in the news. The turning point came when Dillon's longtime friend David Franks saw a newspaper article about the killings and immediately felt sick. The killings matched Dillon's travel patterns, his behavior, and his dark personality. Dillon had even joked about murder before, too casually. Franks made the difficult decision to contact the FBI. That call would change everything. When investigators dug deeper into Dillon's life, the puzzle pieces began to fit. His gun purchases, his travel records, his suspicious behavior, it all aligned with the timeline of the murders. The FBI placed Dillon under surveillance, watching him carefully as he traveled through rural Ohio with rifles in his car. They finally arrested him, not for murder, but for weapons violations and animal killings, crimes they could easily prove while building their case. Once Dillon knew the FBI had him cornered, the mask came off. In interviews, he bragged about the murders, showing a complete lack of remorse. To him, killing was a game, a twisted hobby he enjoyed alone in the woods. He eventually confessed to killing 5 men, though investigators believe the true number may be higher. Dillon was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would never walk free again. He died in prison in 2011. What makes Dillon's crimes so horrifying isn't just the murders themselves, it's the mindset behind them. Dillon didn't kill for money. He didn't kill out of rage or jealousy. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He simply treated human beings like targets, firing from a distance, watching them fall, and then walking away without leaving a trace. Most killers seek some form of connection to their victims. Dillon wanted none. He preferred distance. He wanted to feel powerful without being seen. To this day, outdoorsmen in Ohio remember that era with fear. For years, people avoided isolated fishing spots. Hunters stayed together in groups. Parents kept their sons out of the woods because no one knew when or where the sniper would strike again. Thomas Lee Dillon turned the peaceful Ohio wilderness into a hunting ground, and he was the predator at the top of the food chain. Number 7. Rebecca Auburn. She was a face many wouldn't notice in a crowd. Young, disarmingly calm, someone you might cross paths with in a bar or a late-night walk. But behind that ordinary demeanor lies a chilling story that investigators now describe as a possible serial killing spree, and one that has rocked Columbus. Before the accusations came to light, Rebecca Auburn lived a relatively unremarkable life in Columbus, Ohio. She doesn't have a long or dramatic criminal record that loomed large in public view until very recently. Colleagues and acquaintances say she was quiet, friendly when she chose to be, and not someone who drew attention. To many, she was just another person navigating life in a city full of mixed opportunity and hardship. But law enforcement began to piece together a darker side, a calculated pattern of predation that leveraged vulnerability, isolation, and a deadly drug. Between December 2022 and June 2023, the Central Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, along with detectives from the Columbus Division of Police and agents from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, built a disturbing picture. They allege that Auburn met men for sex, intentionally drugged them, reportedly using fentanyl, and then robbed them of their possessions. What started as suspicion blossomed into a grand jury indictment, charging her with 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, multiple counts of aggravated robbery, felonious assault, corrupting another with drugs, tampering with evidence, and trafficking in drugs. The pattern, according to prosecutors, centers on at least 5 men. On December 13, 2022, investigators say there was an attempted overdose. Then came fatal overdoses. January 15, 2023, April 1, 2023, April 13, 2023, and June 17, 2023. 4 men died. One of the victims on January 15th was identified as Joseph Crumpler, 30, who was found in critical condition before dying at Riverside Hospital, according to Columbus Police. How the investigation came together is chilling. Detectives began tracking these overdoses, noticing links between location, victim profiles, and method. The pattern of men meeting her in a certain area of northeast Columbus raised red flags. The Joint Task Force dug into phone records, surveillance, and financial transactions, slowly, painstakingly connecting dots that most people didn't even realize were there. When they finally confronted Rebecca Auburn, the stakes were enormous. The legal process that followed has been complex. A Franklin County grand jury returned a sweeping indictment, and she was arrested and held in the Franklin County Jail. In court, her defense raised questions about her mental fitness, but a judge later ruled she is competent to stand trial, meaning she understands the charges and can participate in her defense. As of now, the case remains ongoing. There is no conviction yet. The trial has not concluded, and investigators believe there may be more victims. The prosecution is not only focusing on the deaths she is already charged with, but also other possible overdose incidents in the same area and time frame. There is something deeply unsettling about the way Auburn allegedly operated. She used intimacy as a trap, drugs as a weapon, and vulnerability to her advantage. If the charges are true, she wasn't simply a robber. She may be a predator who preyed on trusting or desperate individuals, turning encounters into opportunities for fatal gain. The case raises difficult questions. What drives someone to combine seduction, narcotics, and lethal risk? How many more lives may be connected to her alleged spree? And most hauntingly, how many of her victims will remain unknown, buried under the fog of opioid overdose statistics. Rebecca Auburn's story is still unfolding. It's a reminder that evil can wear familiar faces, and that trust can be weaponized. And even as her trial moves forward, many are left wondering how such a pattern went on for so long, and what else might still be hidden in the shadows. Number 8. Gail Eastwood Ritchie. For more than 20 years, the quiet back roads of Juga County held a secret that no one could explain. A mystery that haunted investigators, frustrated an entire community, and broke the hearts of everyone who heard about it. It began with a discovery so tragic that detectives would never forget the scene. The remains of a newborn infant hidden in the woods, left with no name, no identity, and no explanation. For decades, the child was known only as Gyoga's baby doe. No one knew who the mother was, until a surprising DNA breakthrough led investigators to a woman living an ordinary life just miles away. Her name was Gail Eastwood Ritchie. Before her arrest, Gail lived a quiet and almost invisible life in Northeast Ohio. Born and raised in the region, she grew up in a typical family, attended local schools, and later worked simple jobs. Neighbors described her as polite but distant, someone who didn't socialize much. She eventually married and started a family. On the surface, she lived a stable, uneventful life, the kind that draws no suspicion. But investigators would later learn that a deeply hidden part of her past had been buried literally for decades. And for more than 20 years, she carried a secret that connected her to one of Ohio's most heartbreaking cold cases. The crime dates back to March 1993. A woman walking along a wooded area near Sidley Road in Thompson Township noticed a suspicious container, something that looked out of place in the rural, snow-covered brush. Inside, wrapped and discarded, were the remains of a newborn baby boy. He had been born alive and full term, but he never had a chance at life. Investigators rushed to the scene, but there were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no immediate leads. The case became one of the county's most painful mysteries. Locals held memorials, placed flowers in the woods, and wondered how a child could be abandoned so coldly. But without DNA databases or modern technology, the case quickly went cold. Detectives refused to give up. Over the years, they revisited the evidence, hoping for the day when science would catch up. And that day finally came. In 2018, the Geauga County Sheriff's Office partnered with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and genealogical experts to use advanced DNA technology. They created a genetic profile of the infant and compared it with public genealogy databases. Slowly, a family tree emerged. Distant relatives, cousins, branches connecting across the country. And within those branches, one name kept appearing: Gail Eastwood Ritchie. Detectives began to quietly investigate her. They reviewed her history, examined where she lived in the early 1990s, and interviewed people who knew her. The more they learned, the more everything lined up. She lived close to the wooded area at the time. She was the right age, and the timeline matched perfectly. Finally, investigators approached her. During questioning, they revealed the DNA evidence and the family connections. At first, Gail denied knowing anything about the baby, but the pressure of the evidence was too strong. Eventually, she made an admission. The baby found in the woods was her biological son. What she revealed next stunned investigators. Gail said she had hidden her pregnancy from everyone, including her parents and her boyfriend, who later became her husband. She claimed the birth happened suddenly at home and that the infant did not survive. Instead of seeking help or alerting anyone, she placed the newborn in a bag, then inside a container, and drove to the wooded area in Thompson Township, where she left him. Detectives asked why she hadn't gone to a hospital or why she didn't call for help. Her explanations were vague and inconsistent, leaving investigators doubtful and deeply disturbed. The story took an even darker turn when she admitted something else. Years earlier, she had done the same thing with another infant. Another baby born under similar circumstances, whose remains have never been found. That shocking revelation shattered any belief that the 1993 case was a moment of panic. To investigators, it suggested a calculated pattern, hidden behind years of silence. Gail Eastwood Ritchie was arrested in June 2019 and charged with aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The case gained statewide attention. Courtrooms filled. Families who had mourned Baby Doe for decades finally had a face to attach to the tragedy. Prosecutors argued that Gail had options: hospitals, safe haven laws, family support, but chose concealment instead. They emphasized her admission about the second, still missing infant, showing the jury that this was not an isolated tragedy. The defense tried to argue that Gail panicked, that she was young, overwhelmed, and afraid of her family's reaction. They asked the jury to consider her mental state at the time, to see the act not as intentional killing, but as a desperate mistake. But the evidence, combined with her own statements, painted a grim picture. After a long, emotional trial, the jury found her guilty of multiple charges. In 2020, she was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 15 years. Today, Gail Eastwood Ritchie is serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. As for Baby Doe, he finally has a name and a known mother. Local residents still visit the memorial placed near where he was found, a symbol of a community that cared for a child it never knew. And the revelation of the second missing infant leaves a haunting question hanging over the case. Where is that child, and will their remains ever be found? For investigators, the case stands as one of the most heartbreaking examples of hidden tragedy, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating secrets can remain buried for decades, waiting for the moment when truth and science finally catch up. Number 9, Antonio El Diablo Riano. He was a fugitive for nearly 2 decades, a name whispered on most wanted lists, and yet he hid in plain sight, working as a cop in his hometown in Mexico. Imagine living that double life, wearing a badge by day, but haunted by a crime half a continent away. That man was Antonio Riano, better known as El Diablo. Riano's story begins in December 2004 in Hamilton, Ohio. He was 42 at the time. Around 2:20 p.m., he and Benjamin Becerra, age 25, got into a heated argument outside the Roundhouse Bar on Long Street. Witnesses say they tried to calm things down, but the Isak tension boiled over. According to prosecutors, Riano pulled out a .38 Smith & Wesson and shot Becerra directly in the head, ending his life in a brutal instant. Immediately after the shooting, Riano fled the scene. He left Ohio, disappeared from U.S. law enforcement's reach, and headed for Mexico. Investigators would later discover surveillance footage of him buying ammunition at a Walmart shortly before the shooting, as if he'd planned it. The weapon used in the murder was found days later, hidden in a secret compartment beneath the floor of his Hamilton apartment. For years, Riano stayed on the run. He appeared on America's Most Wanted and remained one of Butler County's most wanted men. But his disappearance didn't lead to obscurity. Somehow he built a whole new life. He returned to Zapotitlan Palmas, a small town in Oaxaca, Mexico, where he became a local police officer. Despite the years, investigators never gave up. U.S. Marshals, the Butler County Prosecutor's Office, and international law enforcement worked together, scouring social media, interviewing contacts, and following any trace of Riano. Their persistence paid off. On August 1st, 2024, they arrested him in Mexico City, handed off by Mexican authorities. When he was flown back to Ohio, the legal drama that had lain dormant for nearly 20 years reactivated. Prosecutors brought Riano to trial in June 2025 in Butler County Common Pleas Court. During closing arguments, they called him El Diablo repeatedly, arguing that he executed Becerra in cold blood. The defense pushed back hard, claiming self-defense. According to them, Becerra had terrorized Riano and his family, and Riano's El Diablo nickname came from volunteer work, not violence. But the jury was not persuaded by the self-defense argument. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they found Riano guilty of murder. At his sentencing hearing on July 14, 2025, the judge gave him 18 years to life in prison, with a required gun specification sentence on top of that. Looking back on the case, it's hard not to be struck by how Riano eluded justice for so long, not because he hid in the shadows, but because he disguised himself in plain sight. He worked as a law enforcement officer in his hometown while his past crime loomed over him like a ghost. His capture and conviction show just how persistent investigators can be, and how sometimes the monster is wearing a uniform. Number 10. Walter Leo Jackson Sr. In the quiet neighborhoods of Cincinnati, Ohio, a case unfolded in the early 2000s that left residents horrified, investigators stunned, and the entire state struggling to comprehend the cruelty behind it. The case of Walter Leo Jackson Sr. would go on to become one of the most disturbing family-related crimes in Ohio's recent history. A story marked by betrayal, violence, and the kind of cold-blooded decision-making that still haunts those who worked it. Walter Jackson Sr. wasn't known as a monster to the outside world. To many, he appeared like a typical man trying to manage a complicated family situation. But beneath that exterior was a growing storm of resentment, jealousy, and emotional instability. What makes this case so shocking is how quickly an everyday domestic conflict escalated into one of Ohio's most tragic and senseless killings. It began with a long-standing feud within his family, arguments, grudges, and unresolved tensions that had built up over years. Neighbors later told investigators they frequently heard shouting from the home, and relatives described Jackson as someone who could switch from calm to furious in seconds. Still, no one believed he was capable of what he eventually did. No one imagined he would cross that line. But on March 11, 2003, everything exploded. That day, a family argument spiraled out of control. Witnesses later heard raised voices and objects crashing inside the home. What followed wasn't an accident. It wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate and violent act driven by anger and an almost chilling level of detachment. In a sudden and brutal attack, Walter Jackson Sr. murdered his own son, 13-year-old Walter Jackson Jr., inside their Cincinnati residence. The details of the crime scene shocked even veteran detectives. The brutality, the force, and the sheer disregard for life made it clear that something far deeper was going on inside Jackson than anyone had realized. Investigators described the scene as rage-driven, noting that Jackson didn't simply lash out. He continued long after the assault should have stopped, as if fueled by something beyond anger. His son never had a chance to defend himself. After the killing, what Jackson did next made the situation even more chilling. Instead of calling for help, instead of attempting to revive his son, he simply walked away from the scene, calmly, quietly, as though the enormity of what he had done never registered in his mind. His ability to detach from the horror he had just caused disturbed investigators, and later the jury who heard the case. He was arrested soon after, and during questioning, detectives were stunned by his demeanor. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't remorseful. He was eerily calm. He spoke in short, blunt sentences, acknowledging the crime without emotion. That lack of remorse became one of the central elements of the prosecution's case. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Jackson's actions were intentional, rooted in long-standing resentment and a history of aggressive behavior. Family members testified about the volatile atmosphere in the home, explaining that the killing wasn't an isolated flash of anger. It was the result of years of tension escalating to a breaking point. What makes this case especially tragic is the age of the victim, a 13-year-old child, still in middle school, still trying to navigate the world, looking up to a father who ultimately turned into his killer. Friends and teachers later described Walter Jr. as a quiet, polite kid who loved video games and sports, a boy with his whole life ahead of him, cut down for reasons that never made sense. The trial was emotionally devastating. Jurors reportedly struggled to listen to testimony from first responders and family members. The impact statements at sentencing painted a heartbreaking portrait of a life stolen and a family shattered. In the end, Walter Leo Jackson Sr. was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But even with the conviction, Ohio residents were left with a difficult truth: that sometimes the most dangerous threats don't come from strangers, but from within the home, hidden behind a familiar face and a seemingly ordinary life. To this day, the case remains one of Cincinnati's most disturbing child murder investigations. It is frequently referenced in discussions about domestic violence, mental instability, and the warning signs that often go unnoticed until it's too late. The story serves as a grim reminder of how unresolved anger and emotional volatility can escalate into tragedy if intervention doesn't happen in time. What stands out most about this case is not only the brutality of the act, but the chilling lack of remorse that followed. Investigators still recall how Jackson spoke about the murder with a detachment that felt inhuman, a detail that has made his case one of the most unsettling in Ohio's criminal history. The murder of Walter Jackson Jr. left a permanent scar on the community. Neighbors who once heard arguments through thin walls now remembered them as warning signals they wished they had acted on. Family members who lived through the trauma continue to carry the weight of what happened, knowing that the person responsible was someone who should have been a protector, not a threat. Walter Leo Jackson Sr.'s crime was not just evil. It was a betrayal of the deepest human bond, the bond between parent and child. And that betrayal is what continues to shock Ohio residents today.